Greetings, everybody, on the week of February 15th, 2026. Relatively quiet week. I could go through all the manufactured Epstein drama that's happened over the past week with Pam Bondi and all of that stuff. It's good. It's not threatening in any way. I'm not going to rush to cover it, although I might at some point this week. But what I'm going to be doing today in this, as far as things have gone in this self-proclaimed administration, pretty quiet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start a series called How We Got Here. And it's kind of a misnomer because none of this stuff that I'm going to be talking about in this series is primary. I would really recommend, before you watch this series, to either read or listen to me. My paper called Mass Child Maltreatment and the Future of Industrial Democracy. I wrote this over the period before the election and then finished it after, finalized it after. That was a crazy making process to have to finalize that paper after the election, but it was I wrote a paper about how the cultural changes of the 1960s and how we raised kids, or rather didn't, kind of allowed them to suffer after the 1960s in the name of mainly sexual freedom for adults. What we did in those decades created multiple lost generations and really helped set the stage for a movement of hopeless people to elect someone who is unfit for office. And in this case, the agenda was an agenda of global destruction, of a global holocaust of the world's people. It's not a good thing, and needless to say, but the way that we got here was through a series of decisions that didn't seem consequential, that people didn't think about or care about, and the people who did, like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, were panned, and I can describe that in a later video if I want to, but it's in the paper, and I've read it aloud. So I would recommend that you go into my description, and I will post the playlist, and I will post my paper in the description of this video, and you can watch those. But so the series name is kind of a misnomer. I don't think any of this stuff is most important, but every political system has vulnerabilities. Ours was one of the first, and so a lot of the bugs were getting tested out. And so I really think sorry about the white balance, that our political system had a lot of vulnerabilities in it that made it more likely that I'm really sorry about the white balance. Thank you. I should probably just set it like this. Okay. That made it much more like we had a bunch of vulnerabilities in our political system that made it less likely that we would be able to recover, or that we would be able to even weather the storm of of what was happening in our culture starting in the 1960s. I should be silencing my phone. That was some dumb Gmail thing, probably, or YouTube. But in any case, the so what I'm going to get into today, I kind of buried the lead, is how the weak presidency that the founders set up and in combination with the way that people actually use the political system has really helped get us to this point, and how counterintuitively one of the reforms that we might need in the future is when we try to make sure that this doesn't happen again, is to make the presidency stronger in ways that it can actually deliver on promises. So the way that the founders set up the framers of the Constitution, who are not our country's only founders, they had a lot of flaws. They had to be dragged into giving us rights in the Bill of Rights, kicking and screaming. Like Ted Sturmer would get very mad at me if I said that they were even necessarily doing their best. They weren't always. But when the framers of the Constitution set up our system, they didn't really have anything else to go on other than Rome. What they were actually looking at the example of Rome very heavily, and they wanted to make sure that, because they were, when Caesar came to power, he promised a bunch of policies, and like every consul promised, and he violated the Constitution. He implemented those policies as the executive without the approval of the Senate, because he knew that the Senate would not approve them. And now the problem with that was that the Senate wasn't elected. The Senate, and there was no House, there was no lower or upper houses, but the Senate was not an elected branch in Rome. And that's why they didn't approve it, because it was all a bunch of corrupt good old boys. So that was the real problem, was that the Senate could not implement a popular policy. But what the founders, the framers, saw, because they were imperfect people that were often very rich, easier it is for the camel to get through the eye of the needle. What the framers saw was a bunch of rabble being able to break the Constitution using their guy. It's what a lot of liberals see today about Trump. A bunch of rabble being able to break the Constitution using their guy as a hammer, and they didn't know what they got themselves into. And I agree about a lot of this sort of not great nature of the that it was not a wise idea to vote for Trump, obviously. Probably much less wise than it was to vote for Caesar in the time of ancient Rome, the Roman Republic, because to vote for Caesar, at least, he had policies that he was going to deliver on, and he wasn't promising to use to weaponize our existential threats in order to wipe humanity off the face of the earth, like Trump was promising in his campaign. And so, like, it might be a fair assessment, but that was what the framers, when they would read that story, they were like, we can't have full democracy. We have to have restraints on the public will, because, which is fair, like having a constitution is a valuable thing to have, a basic law, because we don't want people to be able to get an authoritarian into power like that. And ultimately what happened was that Caesar destroyed the republic because he didn't follow the laws. in a way similar to Trump. He became an actual dictator. There was a civil war. He did a physical coup. He walked across the Rubicon. He did a physical coup, and then he won the civil war that resulted and established himself as dictator. And it would be a lot easier for Trump. He wouldn't have to wage a civil war because he has control over the nuclear arsenal. But thank God he was too dumb to actually do that in the beginning. In any case, so they listened to that story, and what they said was, we aren't going to have the president have any power in terms of making laws. He's going to enforce the laws, and he's going to have power to veto stuff. But if the public wants a law, they have to vote for the right person for Congress. That's their job, to understand that it's Congress's job and not the president. That's their job. And it's that same judgy way of... it's that same kind of judgment that you would get from people who would vote, and from people who talk about this in social studies, as from the founders themselves, because there's a lot of unquestioning admiration of the founders in American social studies. And that's something that Tad really critiques. I don't agree with a lot of his message. I think that he's a soft-core doomer. I think that if the things that he said were correct, that humanity would be doomed. If the timetables that he suggested were correct. But I agree with him that that's a judgy aspect of a lot of American social studies. I love the legislature as a concept. I think it was one of the greatest things, to be clear, that humanity ever invented, was the legislature. But there's a reason why so many people, didn't care, looked the other way when an armed mob stormed through the physical location of the legislature with the goal of implementing a physical coup and keeping Trump as a dictator. A lot of people looked the other way, and there was a reason for that. Like, Congress has some of the lowest approval in history. And the reason why is because Congress is a system. The way Congress works in practice today is that before anything can even go to a vote, it has to go through committee first. And those individual committees have the power to just make a vote disappear. And there's discharge petitions and stuff like that. It doesn't necessarily have to go that way. But the Speaker of the House has the power, who is unelected. He is chosen by the elected members of Congress, but he's unelected. Has the power to prevent any bill from coming to the House floor, as do the leaders of the committees and the committees themselves. They have the power to avoid having a bill come up to a vote. And so, because of that, your senator, your representative, the person that you actually have the power, like they say, vote for a different senator, vote for a different representative if you want change. That's what your social studies teacher will tell you. But your senator, your representative, very often does not have to have those hard votes because they never get put in front of you. You don't know whether, like, I can say, even of politically engaged people, very rarely do they actually know what committees their senator is on. It is such, and it's not that they can't learn, it's just that most of us have hobbies and work and families to take care of. We don't have the time to research what committees people are in. And so, one concept in interface design that developers don't like, either in real estate or software or whatever, but because they have all their grand ideas, but it's an idea that is one of the cornerstones of human interface design, is that I'm going to use grass as an example. You lay down the lawn and you have people walk across the lawn in whatever ways they need to walk, wherever they need to go. And then you lay down the paths along the desire paths that people have actually chosen, the way that people actually use the space. That's how you model. You don't judge, you don't get mad about it. You use the space. You design the space the way the people actually use it. That's one of the cornerstones of human interface design, and I think that it's how we should approach our political system. And so the way that people use our political system is that the majority of people don't even know who their congressperson is, and that's not the best. Like, I think that if we had more discipline and if we were better, if we had less psychological problems in our country, that we would know, most of us, who our congress people are. And I know who mine are. But all three of them. I believe Ed Markey is my senator. I live in Massachusetts. I'm not going to describe which district I live in because that might be a little bit more personally identifiable. But my congressman, my senator, Ed Markey, I believe, occupies that seat still. I don't think he's been replaced yet. And then obviously Elizabeth Warren and I know my House representative as well. But a lot of people don't. And so the way that people actually use the system, and that's a little bit unhealthy, but it's always going to be harder to know who your Congress people are. The way people use the system is that when they want policies to change, what they will do is they will pressure the President of the United States, because that's the easiest person to get in touch with, or they will vote for a president that cares about the things that they care about. And it's pretty rare. The coincidence of wants that even happens is pretty rare. There's a lot of protest. There's a lot of giving up and resignation and just staying home and getting high and forgetting about it. There's a lot of just resignation because it's often the things that people care about are not even in there. But in any case, they will vote for a president who promises them the things that they want, and that president will be the one that and they imagine that president will be able to make change, and maybe they vote for the Congress that president would meet, and maybe they don't. But very often, the actual Congress people, because Congress is so cowardly, because it has such a cowardly design that makes it so easy to avoid responsibility for things, that abstracts everything behind layers of procedure. Any reform behind layers of procedure, behind layers of committees that have to be gotten rid of at the very least if you want to get around them. You have to actually do the discharge petition, and who knows? I didn't even know what a discharge petition was. until a year ago, I just thought that bills had to die in committee. I didn't know that you could have a discharge petition that 218 people could vote for in the House in order to get something up for a vote tomorrow or whenever. I didn't know that. Most people don't. And so, and I don't think that we can expect the next generation to know about that, although we should probably try. We should have much better civics education. But the way that people actually use the system is that a president makes promises, and like you can say all you want that president is being dishonest and bad, and I'm more receptive to judging a presidential candidate than I am to judging a regular person. But that president is making a bunch of promises because that's what the people are voting for them for. It's a dynamic that works very well. But then the president isn't responsible for keeping those promises because it's Congress's job. And so what that does is that it creates decades of broken promises. Like, you have presidents like Bill Clinton, even, who was one of the worst before Trump that we ever had. But he promised several reforms that were important, including on healthcare. And none of it ever got passed because Congress just wasn't willing to do the work. And it wasn't his fault, and it was in a lot of ways. He could have pressured them more, and he did a bunch of other stuff that was obviously bad. But he was able to shirk the responsibility for not keeping a lot of his promises. He passed a lot of laws. He had the veto power over them that were just terrible, like repealing Glass-Steagall. He was one of the worst ones in history. But he got to shirk responsibility to the voters about what actually happened because there were Republicans in Congress and moderate Democrats, and there were people in the committees that made sure that played cover for their fellow Congress people to not have to put things up for a vote so that they wouldn't be responsible. Like, that's the kind of stuff. These are the kinds of calculations that go on. And I think that one of the main reasons why we're in a situation where somebody has come along that, I have a completely different interpretation of the Julius Caesar thing than the founders of the United States. The problem with Julius Caesar wasn't that the people were able to smash the legislature and get what they want. It was that they had to smash the legislature in order to get what they wanted. The way that the Roman system works, and I think that it's a good model, is that the consul had the power to bring stuff up for a vote. And that power is a power that can be abused. I think that we should read as Bibulus abused it a lot, actually. I think that when he would have power, because there were always two consuls that would alternate, Bibulus would obstruct pretty much everything by using, not even with a veto, but by just using because he didn't have that, but by just implementing meaningless votes and taking up all of the Senate's time. And so Bibulus would, and so that is a power that can very much be abused. I think that there should probably be limits on how much the president can actually call for votes. I think that there should be a limit to the amount of times per month or per year that he can do that. It should be only for flagship legislation, like a right to repair bill that was promised in a campaign or something like that. That it should be for keeping campaign promises. The president should not have the power to make Congress miserable or dysfunctional for nothing. But And let me be clear about that. But I think that the president should have that power that ancient Roman consuls have. He was declined that power. He or she was declined that power by America's framers of the Constitution because they did not want a repeat of the Caesar situation where somebody just broke the law. And so, in order to give the people what they wanted. The problem was not the problem. The problem with that whole situation was that the people couldn't get what they wanted through legal means. That was the problem. The problem was not that somebody decided to give them. That was a good problem to have, that somebody wanted to promise them land reform and used extra legal methods to implement land reform, which sound familiar, and he's not doing it with popular policies, but he doesn't have the ability really to do bread in circuses, thank God. But it's a lot of that same desire. The problem is not that the people want things. The problem is that the Roman Senate was a bunch of good old boys that wasn't willing to actually do what the people wanted. And the solution is to fix the corruption problem. The solution is a solution that was actually implemented in the framers. They solved their problem that they were worrying hysterically about, the founders of a Caesar, a repeat of what happened with Julius Caesar in his initial term as consul. They were hysterically worried about that, and they got what they wanted. They fixed the problem by having senators were initially not elected they were elected by the states, the state legislatures, but by having people that were actually elected serve out this role, they fixed the problem. They fixed the problem of a Caesarite just disdain for the law and for procedure. They fixed that problem. It wasn't a good old boys club anymore, or at least it wasn't supposed to be, but there's all of this procedure now that allows them to shirk responsibility, and it does make Congress into a little bit of a good old boys club, which is why so many people didn't care when their building was stormed and their lives were put under threat. And, like, you could say what you want about that from a Christian perspective of love your enemies, but these were people that did a lot of harm that were put in danger on that day. So, the real answer, I think that counterintuitively, I think that the first step, and I have some other ideas about how the American government is broken. I'll talk about the two-party system in the next video. But one of the things that really bit us in the A was that presidents were able to make promises to people, and people used them. People used presidents to do something that they were not actually legally allowed to do. Presidents did not have the power to bring bills that existed somewhere in the Senate, to bring them up to a vote. Presidents do not have that power, and therefore they have no business making pretty much any of the campaign promises that they make in our current system. It's basically just trust me, bro, or hope to God that you happen to vote for the right Congress people and that they don't take any bribes, because I'm sure as hell not going to prosecute them because it's a good old boys club if they do take bribes. It's an awful system. But the president does not have the ability to carry out their campaign promises, and yet they make them. And I don't think that that's the people's problem. I don't think, frankly, that that's necessarily the problem. That it might be a problem of character of the individual presidents. But presidents that are acting in good faith want to make change, and they should have the power to do that. They should have the power to make change easier. I do not. I love legislatures. I think that they are one of the greatest inventions. Legislatures that are based on individual seats representing individual districts, which I'm going to get to next time when I talk about the two-party system, are one of the greatest inventions that humanity has ever created. And it's a tragedy that they've been under such that, like, I really thought that the American legislature would, I thought that it would have been violated in a way that was unrecoverable by now. I thought that we would have had a physical coup under a second Trump administration, but he was too stupid to do that, thank God. I love legislatures, but at some point there has to be a person where the buck stops with them. There has to be a president that can say, I am going to make sure that all of you have to be held accountable. All of you have to say what you think about this bill. If you don't like it, then that's fine. If you want to vote against it, but this is a popular bill, and be prepared to have the people vote you out of office if you vote against this bill. I think that the president ought to have that responsibility like they had in the Roman system. The executive was designed much better, I think, in Rome than in America. Although the legislature was designed worse. It was a big good old boys club that was unelected. And I'm glad that that's gone. But the reason why people vote for Trump is not because they're just silly and they just want to try something out that they don't understand. It's because they've tried everything else and it didn't work. And so now the character of the American people definitely made this system come under pressure. That's why I suggested that you would listen about our cultural problems before we talk about the flaws in the American political system. But it's a flawed system, and I just wanted to get that off my chest. So next video is going to be about how the election of senators and Congress people themselves, the winner-take-all system, is a problem, and how actually the Senate is a little bit better of a model because there are 2 senators, not just 1. But really what we need is multi-member districts in both houses. And I can get into how specifically we can change things to make political parties disposable. That's what I'm going to be getting into in the next video. But in the ways that matter, the presidency has been very weak. In the ways that don't matter, like their ability to break the law, the presidency has been made very strong, and much more so than they should be. They've been made immune in a whole bunch of ways by the Supreme Court. It's not a great scene. The presidency has a lot of lawless power to break the laws, and not a lot of power to make laws that will outlast them. And that is a recipe for disaster. And that's the fundamental issue. It's not about just that all the power should lie in a Congress that can just punt responsibility endlessly. It is that the presidency doesn't actually have the power to legitimately keep its promises. And these campaign promises of the 2024 campaign are a little bit different. I don't think that the president should have the authority to stay in power forever or cancel elections. But why would people be willing to vote for that in the first place? It's because they're in despair. So, anyway, that was a long, maybe rambling video. I hope that there's probably a lot of gaffes in it. I hope we're going to get to the other one soon, and I might talk about the news sometime this week as well. But just something that I had to make a video on. Take care, everybody, and I hope you're all safe and successful in whatever you're doing to fight back. God bless you. Bye.